The flatbed truck backed into the gravel driveway of the lakeside shop at exactly 7 in the morning. Air brakes hissed loudly, kicking up dust that settled over a rusted outboard motor sitting in the weeds. Sarah stepped out of the black luxury SUV, trailing behind the truck. She didn't bother looking at the beautiful lake. She walked straight to the open bay doors, where Elias was wiping heavy grease off his hands. She dropped a single sheet of paper on his wooden workbench. "Sign it," she demanded. $3,000 to scrap this junk, and you should consider it a charity." Elias looked past her designer coat to the flatbed truck. 5 heavy hydraulic V8 engine blocks sat there. They were covered in cheap industrial tarps and dripping dirty oil onto the metal bed. "Your predecessor wanted these old prototypes destroyed," Sarah said with a cold tone. "I'm cleaning house. And my vice president told me you run a cheap disposal site out here in the sticks." She looked around the small shop, her nose wrinkling in disgust. "It certainly looks like a trash heap." Elias did not flinch. He glanced over at the small office door. His 8-year-old daughter, Mia, was peeking out, holding her stuffed bear tight against her chest. Elias looked back at Sarah, took the cheap pen, and signed the paper without a single word. He watched her SUV speed away, leaving a thick trail of dust in the morning air. He didn't feel anger. He felt a quiet, absolute resolve. He whispered a prayer he had held on to for years. "Lord, give me the strength to build a legacy for my child, not just survive the day." If you're a parent fighting a silent battle for your family, I want you to type that exact prayer in the comments right now. "Lord, give me the strength to build a legacy for my child, not just survive the day." Let's stand together. Elias walked over to the first engine block. He grabbed the edge of the heavy tarp and pulled it back. He took a rag from his back pocket and wiped away a thick layer of grime on the side of the steel casting. A small engraved serial number caught the morning light. "Elun." His hands shook slightly. It wasn't from the cold, but from the crushing weight of memory. 5 years ago, he had designed this exact block. He was the chief engineer at Nautica Dynamics back then, a legend in marine propulsion. But when his wife got sick, the corporate world didn't care. They demanded his time, his weekends, his entire life. When she passed away, Elias walked away from it all, without looking back. He chose this quiet lake, this small shop, and most importantly, he chose Mia. He had left his life's work behind, thinking it was lost to corporate greed forever. Now, the arrogant new CEO had just paid him $3,000 to throw it all away. That night, after Mia was fast asleep, Elias picked up his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in half a decade. "Mac, it's me," he said softly into the receiver. "I need you at the shop tomorrow morning. And bring your heavy tools. We have 5 ghosts to bring back to life." By Tuesday, the quiet lakeside shop was completely transformed into a war room. Mac, a retired machinist with hands like worn leather, stood staring at the 5 blocks. "They really threw these out?" Mac asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "They think it's just scrap metal," Elias replied, tightening a steel clamp. "Then let's show them what scrap can do." They worked grueling 16-hour shifts. The sharp smell of fresh oil and machining fluid filled the damp air. Every afternoon, Mia would come out to the bay, carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa. She would sit on a tall wooden stool, watching her father's hands move with absolute, surgical precision. She didn't know he used to run a division of 500 men. She just knew her dad could fix absolutely anything in the world. While Elias was breathing life back into cold steel, a massive storm was brewing in the city. At Nautica Dynamics, Sarah was sitting at the head of a massive glass conference table. She was the brand new CEO, desperately trying to fill her late father's massive shoes. But she was swimming with dangerous sharks. Her vice president, Victor, stood at the projector, smiling smoothly at the board members. "The military contract test is set for Friday," Victor announced with fake confidence. We're using the new modified V8 engines for the demonstration. What Sarah didn't know was that Victor had completely gutted the research and development budget. He had quietly ordered cheap, substandard parts from an overseas shell company he personally owned. He had dumped the original prototypes to cover his shady tracks. Victor was skimming millions, and he was about to let Sarah take the brutal fall when the engines iniably failed. Life has a funny way of exposing the truth, doesn't it? Adversity will always rip the mask off a liar. That brings me back to our prayer. Lord, give me the strength to build a legacy for my child, not just survive the day. If you haven't commented it yet, please do it now. Let your dedication be known to the world. Friday morning arrived, with a heavy, relentless downpour. Out on the choppy waters of the testing bay, the military brass stood on the wet deck of a cruiser. They watched through binoculars. As Nautica's new test boat revved its engines, Sarah stood next to Victor on the dock, gripping the metal railing tight. The test boat accelerated violently. For 10 seconds, it looked absolutely beautiful cutting through the waves. Then, a loud, sickening crack echoed across the open water. Thick black smoke billowed from the stern of the boat. The vessel sputtered, lost all power, and went completely dead in the water. The lead general turned to Sarah, his face pale with pure fury. You promised us marine dominance, Miss CEO. You just gave us a floating coffin. The contract is pulled, effective immediately. Sarah felt the entire world spin out of control. Millions of dollars were gone in a single instant. The proud company her father built was suddenly on the verge of total bankruptcy. She looked over at Victor, but he was already stepping back into the shadows, pretending to be just as shocked. Cold panic set in. She rushed back to her office and locked the heavy oak door. Sarah sat on the cold floor of her office, surrounded by boxes of her late father's private files. She was desperate. She needed to know what the original engines were actually supposed to be. At the bottom of a dusty cardboard box, she found a heavy leather binder labeled M-Class Prototypes. Do not destroy. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were the original, hand-drawn blueprints for the exact hydraulic engines they desperately needed, and in the bottom right corner of every single page was a faded signature. Elias Thorne, Chief of Engineering. Tucked behind the very last page was a photograph taken 5 years ago. It was her father, smiling broadly, with his arm around a younger man in a grease-stained shop shirt. Sarah stared at the younger man's right hand, holding a wrench. There was a jagged, unmistakable scar across the knuckles. The exact same scar she had seen on the man who signed her disposal paperwork for $3,000 just a week ago. The man she boldly called a bottom feeder to his face. She kept digging, frantically. Beneath the binder, she found a hidden USB drive containing Victor's shadow accounts, the fake suppliers, the offshore wires. The truth hit her like a massive freight train. Victor had orchestrated the whole thing, and she had blindly handed him the shovel to bury her father's legacy. It was past midnight when her luxury SUV tore down the muddy gravel road toward the lake. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets. When Sarah pushed open the bay doors of the small shop, she didn't find a trash heap. She found a cathedral of steel. Sitting right in the center of the room, hooked up to a massive testing rig, was Block EL001. It was spotless, it was beautiful, and it was running perfectly. The deep, rhythmic roar of the finely tuned V8 shook the concrete floor. It was putting out more horsepower than her current engineers had ever simulated, running incredibly smooth and steady in the green zone. Elias stood by the control panel, holding a heavy wrench, quietly watching the gauges. He didn't look surprised to see her standing there. He just reached over and cut the ignition. The massive engine spun down into total, heavy silence. Sarah stood there, dripping wet, completely stripped of all her corporate armor and arrogance. She looked at the masterpiece engine, then at Elias. When you put your heart into your work, your legacy will always speak for itself. You don't have to shout to prove your worth. Let's say our prayer together one last time in the comments. Lord, give me the strength to build a legacy for my child. Not just survive the day. I was an absolute fool, Sarah said, her voice shaking in the quiet room. I paid you to throw away the only thing that can save my father's company. I know exactly who you are now. Elias. Elias slowly wiped his hands on a clean rag. You didn't know, he said calmly. But Victor did. He knew exactly what he was throwing away. The military gave us 48 hours to provide a working prototype. Or they bankrupt us completely, she said, stepping closer. I need to buy these back. I will give you $4 million. Right now. Out of my own personal trust fund. Elias looked over at the office door. Mia was fast asleep on the small couch inside. Completely safe. He looked back at the desperate CEO. I will sell them back to you, Elias said slowly, on 2 conditions. First, Victor goes to federal prison. I have the technical files you need to prove his fraud. And the second? She asked, barely breathing. I keep 15% equity in Nautica Dynamics as an independent technical advisor, and I don't ever put on a suit. I work from here. Sarah didn't even hesitate. Done. By Monday morning, the corporate world was turned completely upside down. Federal agents walked right into Nautica headquarters and escorted Victor out in handcuffs in front of the entire board of directors. The military contract was saved. The exact moment they saw Elias's engines perform flawlessly on the open water. But the real change didn't happen in the boardroom. 3 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Sarah drove her SUV back up the gravel driveway. She wasn't wearing a designer coat. She wore an old sweatshirt and faded jeans. She walked into the shop and sat down on a wooden crate next to Mia. The little girl handed Sarah a small piece of sandpaper and a wooden block. You have to go with the grain, Miss Sarah, Mia said seriously. Dad says fighting the wood just ruins it. Sarah smiled, a real, genuine smile. I think your dad is absolutely right, sweetie. Elias watched them from the workbench. He picked up his cup of coffee, took a long sip, and looked out over the calm water of the lake. He had finally built his legacy, and he didn't have to leave his home to do it.